Hi. Hello. My name is Stephanie and welcome, or if you're coming back, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here and I hope you're well. And happy holidays to you and yours from me and mine. As this is going to be my last video of the year being 2024 for those of you in the future, I thought we should visit the Dollenganger series one last time in 2024, and so today we're talking about Christopher's Diary, Secrets of Foxworth, and Christopher's Diary, Echoes of Dollenganger, both by V.C. Andrews, so spoilers for both books, as well as for the original Dollenganger saga, as I'm going to be referencing events from that throughout this, as do both of these books that we're talking about today. Also, because this is the Dollenganger series, content warning for incest, SA, child neglect, emotional abuse, religious abuse, forced food insecurity. A lot of this stuff is only referenced throughout these two books, but as this is the Dollenganger series, it can be a lot. So before we get into the story, I want to talk about the books themselves, because I think this background stuff is a big part of why these books are the way that they are, and to be perfectly blunt about it, I just straight up don't like these books. I don't. That we're going to get into that throughout. And I talked about this in my Garden of Shadows video, but I think it's relevant here too. While there are technically more than 80 V.C. Andrews books, 2 of which came out this year, 2024 for those of you in the future, V.C. Andrews herself actually only wrote 8 books in her lifetime. She passed away in 1986. Her family hired a ghostwriter, Andrew Niederman, to finish her remaining manuscripts, one of which was Garden of Shadows, which is a prequel to the Dollenganger series, which was released in 1987, a year after her death, and the other manuscript was Fallen Hearts, which is the third book in the Castile series, which was released in 1988. Okay, so everything since 1988 has been written by Andrew Niederman. Secrets of Foxworth and Echoes of Dollenganger are the first 2 books in a trilogy of spin-offs/sequels, kinda not really, but we'll get to that in another video, all 3 of which were released in 2015, 31 years after Seeds of Yesterday was published and 28 years after Garden of Shadows was published. It's also worth mentioning that the most recent film adaptations of the Dollenganger series, those being the Lifetime movies, were released in 2014 and 2015, respectfully. I'm not knocking this in the slightest, I just think it's worth mentioning. Secrets of Foxworth and Echoes of Dollenganger take place about 17 to 18 years after the end of Seeds of Yesterday, which, for your reference, ended in 2001 with Kathy's death. So it's roughly 2018-2019 in the first 2 novels. We'll talk about the final novel and where it falls in the timeline at the end of this video, but just keep that in mind moving forward, that it's about 2018-2019. And with that, let's get into the Christopher's Diary duology, which is what I've been calling it. Like I said, these are the first 2 novels in a trilogy of spin-off/sequel novels. Again, we'll get into that a little more in another video. But these first 2 novels follow 17-year-old Kristen Masterwood, who is a distant Foxworth relative through her mother, who died when she was 5. Her mother is never given a name. Love that. We never learn exactly how she's related to the Foxworth either, but we do know that she is a distant relative, like I said, through her mother. Kristen lives with her father, Bert Masterwood, in Charlottesville, and he owns a construction company that has recently been hired to clear the estate and rebuild Foxworth Hall, which was burnt down for a second time in about 2003. We are never given any more information about this, save for a few references to the owner of Foxworth Hall being suspected of having been the one who started the fire. I assume this is a reference to Bart, being that Foxworth Hall was his house at the end of Seeds of Yesterday. Neither Bart, Jory, Cindy, or any of Kathy's grandchildren appear or even mentioned in these 2 books. Kristen is our narrator, and these references to the former owner of Foxworth Hall burning it down in about 2003 are the only references we get to any of Kathy's children. Foxworth Hall burnt down. Again. And the property and the ruins of the mansion have been sitting there untouched for years and have essentially been left to rot ever since. And so, okay, to editorialize a bit on my part, because I'm going to get kind of mean as we go on. And like I said, I just straight up do not like these books. That being said, there's genuinely a lot in this first book, Secrets of Foxworth, that I think works well and that I actually enjoyed. And I think that's part of what annoyed me so much, because there's the pieces of something really good here. And this is one of those pieces. So from Kristen, we learn that the Foxworth family is incredibly infamous in Charlottesville and widely despised by the entire town, who knows about Chris, Kathy, Cory, and Carrie and their imprisonment in the attic. They don't know all the gory details, but they have a vague and fairly accurate depiction of the broad strokes. That 4 children were locked in an attic for over 3 years, although interestingly, Malcolm and Olivia are the ones who are blamed for this rather than Corinne, as they were widely disliked already by the people in town for their excessive piousness and Malcolm's unethical business practices, and Corinne is seen as just as much a victim of them as the kids were, which again I think is very, very interesting, and I wish more was done with that. They also know that one of the children, a little boy, died shortly before their escape, after which the surviving children disappeared, and no one knows if they are alive or dead. And as such, the story of the children in the attic and what they endured has become a kind of urban legend / unsolved true crime mystery, which numerous articles have been written about. And in turn, the ruins of Foxworth Hall have become the local haunted house, a place where kids dare each other to go at night, and there are even rumors that the little boy who died is buried somewhere on the grounds and that his ghost haunts the place. So, how do they know all this? Well, if you were hoping that Kathy's memoir was published posthumously by one of her sons, like I was, you're going to be as disappointed as I was, because that is not the case. But you might be asking yourself, Stephanie, if Kathy's book was never published, how did the story get out? Well, we find out from Kristen's uncle, her dad's brother, that the story was spread by former servants who worked in Foxworth Hall. It's never explicitly stated in either book, but I'm kind of assuming that it was witnesses from Kathy crashing Corinne and Bart's Christmas party at the end of Petals on the Wind, and we also find out from her uncle that one of them even tried to sell the story of the 4 children being locked in an attic to a movie studio, but the studio ended up turning it down as they thought it was too outlandish. I really wish the novels had leaned harder into this angle, because I think it touches on something incredibly compelling with the story of Chris, Kathy, Cory, and Carrie being something that has been mythologized and commodified the way true crime stories sometimes are, especially in this day and age. Because in the context of the Dollenganger series, these were real children who endured horrific child abuse, and one of them even died at the hands of their own family after again enduring this absolutely unimaginable child abuse. And they've essentially become a ghost story, an urban legend. Hell, no one is even really sure of their names or even what they look like. Essentially become more of a story than they have people. And again, I think this is a very interesting thing that the novel touches on. I had never seen a picture of them, and Dad told me that he and my mother hadn't either. In fact, no one had seen any picture of them when they were shut up in the attic or even soon afterward. There were some drawings in newspaper stories, but their accuracy was always in question, as were the facts in the stories. Supposedly, the children who survived the ordeal never talked about what happened, but that didn't stop the tales of horror. They were always reprinted around Halloween with grotesque drawings depicting children scratching on locked attic windows, their faces resembling Edvard Munch's famous painting The Scream, making it all look like someone's nightmare. In a few weeks, those stories and pictures would appear again. And this is one of the most genuinely interesting aspects of these books to me, and I wish more was done with it, but unfortunately, that is not the case. And so our story kicks off when Kristen is visiting the Foxworth property with her father not long after his company has been given the contract and have begun clearing away the ruins of the mansion. And while she's kind of exploring the grounds, she discovers a diary hidden in what's left of the attic. A diary that somehow survived not 1 but 2 house-destroying fires and 1 complete rebuild, but okay, sure, I'm not gonna harp on that too much. We're just gonna go with it. The diary that she discovers belonged to a boy named Christopher Dollenganger. Given where she finds it and her father confirming that he thinks one of the kids was named Chris, she pretty quickly figures out that this belonged to one of the children who was locked in the attic. Now, Kristen has lived in the shadow of the Foxworth her entire life, and having lost her mother very young, she's eager to learn more about where she comes from. Again, there's something really interesting here, and I wish something more had been done with this idea. However, Bert is very hesitant to let her take and read the diary, because even though it's been decades and his wife was only a distant relative, his daughter even more so, their family does occasionally still get harassed because of their connection to the Foxworths. And also, even though he doesn't believe the more fantastic aspects of the story, like the grounds being haunted or there being a dead body buried somewhere around, the fact remains that these kids suffered horrible abuse, and he's worried about the effect that reading about that would have on his daughter. I like Bert. Bert's a good dad, and honestly, the relationship between him and Kristen is one of my favorite parts of these books. Bert cares about her and respects her and listens to her and supports her and loves her. Like I said, I like Bert. Bert's a good guy. And although he is very reluctant to do so, does end up letting Kristen take the diary, with the promise that she won't tell anyone about it because, again, their family has been harassed because of their connection to the Foxworths, who are, again, despised by the entire town. And also, he doesn't want what happened to the kids to turn into more of a spectacle than it already is. Like I said, I like Bert. Bert's a good guy. And again, I wish the novel had leaned more into this aspect. The commodification and sensationalization of true crime and of stories like this. Again, there is the pieces of something very, very interesting and compelling here. Just kind of wish something more had been done with it, but I digress. And Kristen agrees not to tell anyone, and so she takes the diary home and starts reading it, in which we learn that Chris started writing the diary just before their escape from the attic. So if something happened to them, that there would be some record, some bit of tangible proof that they were here, they existed, that this happened, just in case they didn't make it, which is so horribly tragic, because when they escaped, Chris was an 18-year-old kid who had been beaten and starved and imprisoned and poisoned, who literally fed his little brother and sister his own blood and raw mice to keep them alive, trying to leave behind something that proved that he and his siblings were here, that they existed, that they mattered, that this happened to them, in case they ended up dying too. And this, regardless of how I feel about these books, this is a painfully tragic moment, and it's very well done. But with that being said, Christopher's diary entries are the weakest parts of these books, in my opinion, which is not great, because the first two books in this trilogy are literally built around these entries. The entries are extremely out of character. They grind the pacing to a halt, and the pacing, in my opinion, is already not great. We're going to talk more about the technical stuff at the end, but the diary entries do not help with the pacing issues that this book has, in my opinion. And to be kind of blunt about it, they don't really add anything new to the story, save for adding some insights into what the Dollenganger family dynamic was like when Christopher Sr. was alive, which, again, I wish we'd gotten more of, because we really don't know much about what their life was like before his death, but we'll get to that in a second. But we really don't learn anything new about their time in the attic, nor do the diary entries add anything more to the story that we already know. Granted, I do think if you had somehow started with this book and had never read Flowers in the Attic, that you'd probably find these entries compelling, but if you have, these entries just come across as painfully repetitive, which again does not help some of the pacing issues that this book has. And as Kristen begins to read Chris's diary, she begins to become obsessed with it to the point where literally all she's doing is reading the diary. She's barely sleeping, she's not doing her schoolwork, she's not seeing her friends, and she's barely paying attention in school. But she also finds herself growing closer to Kane Hill, the son of the richest family in Charlottesville and the most popular boy in school. And y'all, this book really pulled one over with me with Kane, because he starts out as this really kind, super supportive, and genuinely nice kid. I liked Kane. I really did. I liked him. I liked him. And then one day when Kane comes over to Kristen's house to study, he finds the diary, which she accidentally left out in her rush to get downstairs and open the door, having lost track of time, because again, all she is doing is reading this diary, and it is taking over her life. And despite him only reading the first page, which, as kind of an aside, is a really weird thing to do, now that I'm saying all this out loud, because the book is clearly a diary, and he's a guest in her house, and he just reads it while she's downstairs. That is weirdo behavior. But anyway, after reading the first page and knowing the story about the children, again, having grown up in Charlottesville his entire life, Kane is able to figure out pretty quickly what he's looking at. And to Kristen's surprise, he wants in. Because again, the shadow and the legacy of the Foxworth and their sins have loomed large over Charlottesville and everyone in it for years. And although she's reluctant at first, Kristen does eventually agree to let Kane read Chris's diary, only after making him swear that he won't tell anybody that she has it or what's in it, which he immediately agrees to. And this is where Secrets of Foxworth comes to an end, with a very, in my opinion, kind of disturbing request from Kane. He looked up at the ceiling and nodded to himself. "What?" I asked. This, for your reference, is right after Kristen agrees to let Kane read Chris's diary with her. "And to get into it, really into it, we'll read it in the attic," he said. Yeah. And Kristen agrees to that. And I think she does so because of her obsession with Chris and the diary. And I'll take it one step further. I think that obsession is why she agrees to let Kane in on her secret, because this is the very last paragraph of Secrets of Foxworth. Reference, this is almost immediately after Kristen agrees that they're going to read this diary together up in her attic. I nodded and started to leave the room. I looked back. He being Kane, was sprawled on my bed, and as crazy as it might seem, I didn't see him. I saw Christopher Dollenganger, waiting for me to join him in the attic. Again, like I said, I think the whole reason Kristen agrees to all of this, to Kane reading the diary with her despite her promise to her father, and to going up into the attic and reading it to get closer to the story. I think the whole reason she agrees to these things is because she is so deep in her obsession with Chris and his diary. And again, this is one of those pieces of this book that is genuinely just so good, and I wish something more had been done with it. But like I said, that is the end of Secrets of Foxworth. Before we get too deep into Echoes of Dollenganger, I want to talk about what we learn about the Dollenganger family and their dynamic before Christopher Sr. died, because those entries are the most interesting ones to me, and we learn that despite their outward appearances, and even in the rose-colored recollections of both Chris and Kathy, that life in the Dollenganger house was not as perfect as people thought, and that we have been led to believe. Corinne's jealousy and resentment of Kathy started long before she locked those kids in that attic. And she was jealous of the closeness that Kathy and Christopher Sr. shared. Now, to be very clear, this is in no way like the relationship that Corinne had with her father Malcolm in Garden of Shadows, not in the slightest. But Christopher and Kathy were very close, and Corinne was jealous of that, so much so that even Chris, as a young kid, noticed. We also learn that Corinne often used Chris as her emotional support. She talked to him about the issues in her marriage and, issues that she was having in her personal life, which, don't do that to your kids. Don't do that. Sadly, we don't spend a lot of time on the Dollenganger children's life before they were imprisoned in Foxworth Hall, but I like this little bit that we got, and I think it adds another layer of very interesting and painfully tragic layers to their story, and I wish we'd gotten more of that, but instead we get this. Echoes of Dollenganger follows Kristen and Kane, again this is still Kristen as our narrator, as they read the rest of Chris's diary in Kristen's attic, which Kane has arranged to look as much like the attic in Foxworth Hall as he could, which is super normal and not at all creepy, I guess. But not only that, and buckle up for this one, folks. Kane goes out and buys a blonde wig, which he wears while they read the diary. Again, this is all super normal and not at all terrifying. For your reference, Kristen went downstairs to get them, food and drinks to take up in the attic with them, and she has come back up. I walked up the stairs, carefully balancing everything on the tray. Kane had left the attic door open for me. I entered and stopped dead in my tracks. Kane had unfolded and set up the sofa bed, but that wasn't what surprised me. It's what he was wearing, what he had obviously kept hidden in his book bag all day. He was wearing a wig with a shade of flaxen gold hair nearly identical to my hair color. Again, for your reference, Kristen inherited the Foxworth looks of, the very blue eyes and the very blonde hair. I didn't speak. I just gaped at him and had this eerie feeling shudder through my body. "Say something," he said. "It's pretty good, isn't it? I stole some strands of your hair from your hairbrush a few times and put them together to give the wig store guy a pretty accurate idea of the color I wanted. This was made specifically for me. I'm assuming Christopher's hair would be this long by now. I have this feeling he wore it this way anyway," he added. Okay, just so we're all holding space for the same horrifying information, Kane stole strands of Kristen's hair to make a wig so that he can essentially cosplay as an imprisoned, abused child. I'm going to give you a second. With that. And she even remarks how much it looks like her own hair, so that he can look like her brother. Okay? And it doesn't stop there. We're not that lucky. Kane later has Kristen wear a nightgown like Kathy's and even has her cover her hair after they read about Olivia covering Kathy's head with tar. All the while he's wearing the wig that he had made from stolen strands of her hair to look like he could be her brother, while they are hanging out in the attic that they've set up to look like the one in Foxworth Hall. And this is weird, right? This is weird. Like, I'm not crazy, this is weird. And it's never pointed out in the narrative how utterly bizarre and wildly inappropriate that all is, but I digress. As Chris and Kathy, within the context of his diary, begin to grow closer, Kane begins pressuring Kristen to sleep with him, which is both a, excuse the language, shitty thing to do, and believe it or not, only gets worse from here, so unfortunately, put a pin in that. While all this is going on, Bert and his company are making decent progress rebuilding Foxworth Hall, and he's learned that the new owner hasn't been exactly forthcoming about who they are. The land and the house were purchased by a psychiatrist named Dr. Martin West, but he didn't actually buy the house for himself. He actually bought it on behalf of a wealthy businessman named William Anderson and his also unnamed wife. Don't love that. Who had some very specific requests for the rebuilt mansion, including that it had to be made completely accessible as William Anderson is a wheelchair user, but also under no circumstances, despite the original plans calling for it, of course, is the rebuilt house to have an attic. "The darndest thing," he said, "but I was given quite a challenge today. Of course, there's time enough to adjust things, and I suppose this works with the architectural. No structural problems with the roof." "What is it?" I asked, wondering if he would ever say, "Oh, there'll be no attic. I mean, there'll be a crawl space, but no actual attic. Of course, lots of homes don't have attics today. Wasted space for most. Things go up in those storage places you rent or just given away. No one wants memories." "So why is it so weird?" "Oh, it's not so weird. It's just that the original plan had a sizable attic, and then this new order came down the pike." Which, of course, could mean nothing. However, Bert also finds out through the grapevine that Dr. West was Corinne's former doctor at the facility where she'd been institutionalized after she burned down Foxworth Hall, for the first time. Which again, this of course could mean nothing. As I'm sure you can tell from the horrifying information that I shared with you earlier, Kane is also becoming, unhealthily so in my opinion, obsessed with Chris's diary. And he begins to change. He becomes very, very cold and cruel to everyone around him, his friends, his teachers, his own family, including Kristen, who unfortunately has to bear the brunt of his attitude change because she won't sleep with him, because he's a trash person. This all comes to a head when Kristen and Kane sleep together for the first time in the attic, which happens almost immediately after they read about Chris's assault of Kathy, which, again, for your recollection, happened in Flowers in the Attic after he found out that she kissed Bart. And what's worse is that this moment between Kristen and Kane is painted as sweet and deeply romantic, which, respectfully, no. After they finish the diary, Kristen and Kane go looking for Dr. West, as they are now convinced William Anderson is actually Chris, who has survived and returned to rebuild Foxworth Hall under a new name. So they skip school and head to his office and tell him their theory. And in a wildly spectacular display of violating doctor-patient confidentiality, Dr. West tells him that yes, one of the Dollenganger children has returned under the name William Anderson, but that it wasn't Chris. The doctor had described how her mother had gotten a replica of a child's skeleton, talking about Olivia, and put it in a trunk, suggesting that it was her poisoned child. Dr. West said it was one of the things that had sent her over the edge of sanity. So, Cory is alive. According to Dr. West, Olivia and Corinne basically dumped him out at a hospital in another town and just kind of took off and assumed he died due to the arsenic poisoning and that no one would be able to identify him and thus tie him to the Foxworths. But Cory didn't die, although he did end up partially paralyzed due to the arsenic poisoning and suffering from really severe memory loss, probably due to the trauma that he had suffered. Cory was then adopted by a millionaire who had lost a grandson his age in a horrible drunk driving accident not long before Cory turned up at the hospital. So Cory was raised as William Anderson, and from what we can tell, he seems to have had a great life. He's successful, has a wife and kids. He's gone to therapy to deal with what happened to him. Granted, he probably should have picked a better psychiatrist than this guy. Excuse the language, but this makes absolutely no fucking sense for a myriad of reasons. But do you want to know the one that bothers me the most? The one that pisses me off, to be kind of blunt about it? Petals on the Wind, we see Kathy finally confront Corinne about their imprisonment and Cory's death. And I didn't talk about this in that video because I was saving it to complain in this one. But during this confrontation, she tells Corinne that she and Chris, after they escaped and were living with Paul, had searched for any record of Cory being buried nearby or in any of the surrounding towns, looking for any unclaimed little boys who died in October of 1960, but they could never find anything. So they assumed that Corinne hid him somehow, covered this all up. But when Kathy visited the attic before coming downstairs to crash the Christmas party, she noticed something very disturbing while she was up there. This is kind of a long scene, but it is relevant, and for your reference, this takes place during Kathy's confrontation with Corinne while Bart is there, after Corinne finally admits that Kathy is her daughter. "Mama," I began in a flat voice, "what did you really do with Cory's body? We have looked in all the cemeteries around here and checked their records. Not one little boy of 8 years died in the last week of October 1960. She swallowed first and wrung her hands, flashing all those diamonds and other jewels. "I didn't know what to do with him," she whispered. "He died before I could reach the hospital. Suddenly he stopped breathing, and when I looked in the back seat, I knew he was dead." She sobbed with the memory. "I hated myself then. I knew I could be charged with murder, and I hadn't meant to kill him, only make him a little sick. So I threw his body in a deep ravine and covered him over with dead leaves, sticks, and stones." Her huge, desperate eyes pleaded with me to believe. I too had to swallow, thinking of Cory in a deep, dark ravine left to decay there. "No, Mama, you didn't do that." My soft voice seemed to cut through the frozen atmosphere of the huge library. I visited the end room of the northern wing before I came here. I paused for better effect and made my words more dramatic. I respect that. Before I came down the stairs to confront you, I first used the stairs that led directly up to the attic, then the hidden stairway in the closet of our prison. Chris and I always suspected there was another way into the attic, and correctly we reasoned that there had to be a door hidden behind the giant heavy armoires that we couldn't shove out of the way no matter how hard we pushed. Mama, I found a small room we'd never seen before. There was a particular order in that room, like something dead and rotten. It's not a fake child skeleton. That's not a fake child skeleton. And that bothers me so much. You have no idea. It drives me crazy. Cory's death is one of, if not the most important moment in the entire Dollenganger series. His death is tragic and terrible and cruel, and it is the catalyst for literally everything that comes after. It's what pushes Chris and Kathy to finally come to terms with what their own mother is capable of, and it's what finally pushes them to make their escape from the attic with Carrie before she and they both die. Hell, it's the effect that his death has had even years later on Carrie that leads her to take her own life. Cory haunts the narrative. Kathy takes her final steps up into that attic one last time. And undoing that moment for a cheap twist is lazy and uncreative in my opinion. And this is where Echoes of Dollenganger ends, with Kristen and Kane outside William Anderson, Cory's, house where he lives with his wife while Foxworth Hall is being rebuilt, intending to give him Chris's diary. We never get any resolution to any of this because, like I said, this is where the story ends. And the third book in the trilogy, titled Secret Brother, takes place in November and December of 1960. And without getting too deep into the woods with that one, at least not right now, like I said, we're gonna get there. It follows the family that takes Cory in after he's dumped at the hospital. So there's no real resolution to anything in these books, and honestly, this didn't need to be 2 books in my opinion. This could have been condensed into 1. Let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. I don't think these books are badly written. I actually like the writing style, and I think it's better when Niederman leans into his own style rather than trying to imitate Andrew's. And like I said, there's genuinely a lot that I think these books do well. I like the dynamic between Kristen and Bert. I think there was a lot of potential in the Dollenganger children's stories becoming a kind of myth. And I think it touches on some really interesting things about the way true crime has kind of become a commodity, especially nowadays. For the most part, I really liked Kristen. She comes across as a little I'm not like other girls at times, but I think she's a balanced enough character that it's not horrible. Although, just as kind of an aside, none of the teenagers in this talk or act like teenagers, at least not from this day and age, and it comes across as very how do you do fellow kids at points, but honestly I've read worse, so it's not that bad. And while they have their technical issues, the pacing is super choppy. Chris and Kathy are extremely out of character, with Chris being painted as overly analytical and often cold, which he could be sometimes. But Chris was also deeply caring and felt things very intensely and deeply, none of which come across here in his own diary entries. And Kathy is depicted as immature and childish, which again she absolutely could be, but that's not all she was. And these books make it very much seem like Chris was the one holding the children together in the attic, rather than being Chris and Kathy together, who kept them together and kept them afloat. But I would say especially Kathy. And I will not stand for slander of Kathy. Not in this house. Not in this house. But by far the worst thing about Secrets of Foxworth and Echoes of Dollenganger is how utterly pointless they feel. Chris's diary entries don't add anything new to the story, and if you've already read Flowers in the Attic, which I'm assuming you have if you're this deep into the series, it all feels painfully repetitive, which again does not help with the pacing issues that these books have. Kristen's relation to the Foxworth doesn't really matter. She could have just been a random person who found the diary, and there's nothing really interesting done with that plot point, which is unfortunate. Kathy's children and grandchildren were written out of the story completely, even though at the end of Seeds of Yesterday, they were kind of set up as being the next generation if this story was going to continue. Although I do think Seeds of Yesterday does feel very, very final and like a very final conclusion. If the story had continued, it would have continued with them, and they are written out of this completely. And on top of all that, it undoes one of the most important moments in this entire series, all for the sake of a cheap twist. And it feels lazy and disingenuous and uncreative to me, and I hate it. So, final thoughts. Just read the original series. Just read the original series. Thanks so much for listening to all that and just for being here. Seriously, it means just so much to have you all here, and I am just beyond grateful, and I don't say it nearly enough, but thank you so much for being here and for always listening to all that. And happy holidays to you and yours, and until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one, and Happy New Year. Bye-bye.